And just a reminder as well that this webinar is sponsored by the School of Environment and Sustainability, and we have fantastic programs in that school that you can see here in that little behave. So all the programs we offer, you can find them on the website, and I'll send you a link to it. And we're here to talk about climate science resistance. Very excited for me to be here in the room with Rick Kool. Do you want to just say a quick hi?
Yeah, hi everyone. Looking forward to hearing these are ideas that I'm putting forward. They're sure not finished, and that's maybe the best way to have a conversation at the end. Yeah.
Agreed. Thank you. And I am Nancy Prévost-Maurice. I'm an education specialist here at Railroads University. And just before I pass it over to Rick, I just want to invite you to take a deep breath, connect your feet to the ground, and just acknowledge that we are on traditional lands. So here at Railroads University, we are located on the traditional land of the Cosapsan and the Lagwagan families and ancestors, also known as the Sunhi and Esquimalt. It is with deep gratitude that we work, play, learn on those lands, and where the past, present, and future of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people all come together. So thank you. And again, if you know the traditional lands you're joining us from, please put them in the chat. And I'll just pass it over to Rick. Here is the quick agenda for today. We have an hour together. And as we go through the presentation, please ask questions and use the chat to interact with us.
Yeah,
Thank
wonderful.
you so much.
Okay, now let me see if I can make this work now. I'm going to share my screen, and then I'm going to futz around a little bit to get it to work. All right, so that's the one. Okay, and now. Okay, and now I want to just change this.
Yeah, we see it perfectly.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Oh, now we see your notes though.
Now I see my notes. Okay, so
yeah.
I want to undo. Oh boy. Okay, so excuse me. We'll try it again. Share.
I'm sure people in the room have been there too.
Yes,
I certainly did.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to tell you a bit of a story first to get going on this. I am very interested in religion. I'm part of the Congregation Emmanuel, the historic Jewish community here in Victoria. So I have an interest in religion, and I've always felt myself that many practitioners of any religious faith really find very little difficulty in living in the 21st century, finding maybe guidance, direction, meaning, and solace and hope and strength from the diverse religious traditions that are available to all of us. And that practitioners of all faiths routinely accept civil authority as broadly governing the terms of acceptable behavior for all citizens, while accepting particular stringencies, perhaps, on their own behaviors in accordance with their religious beliefs. And practitioners of all faiths routinely accept membership in pluralistic societies and communities where even faced with contradictory expectations of behavior can be accepted as having a rightful place in that society as neighbors, and cultural diversity is seen as a not as a threat but as a benefit. And practitioners of all faiths have no problem being scientists and carrying out research within the broad ground rules of science, and that whereas science has ground rules for the discovery of things in the physical universe, for many, religion is also a means of discovery, but it's more of a guide to a moral universe, not necessarily a guide for a physical universe. And even non-religious scientists are able to accept even religious non-scientists are able to accept the authority of science to make claims and offer advice and provide guidance. So what I want to talk about today is it ends up, it didn't start out this way for me, with an examination of what authority means in the context of religion and science and communication of science to what I'm calling science-resistant religious communities, because I know that not all religious believers are willing to accept authority that conflicts with the authority of their religious denomination. and that the authority that that denomination demands their members holding. And this can be a real problem. But it all began, oops, I get the right button here. It all began on the 2nd of April, 2020, just as the pandemic was really getting cranked up. And so this map appeared in the New York Times, and it showed where people, or when people stopped traveling more than 2 miles at a time that, broadly speaking, society was being asked to lock down and stop moving around because of the pandemic. So I saw this map in the New York Times, and I thought, I recognized this. This looked like a map that I'd seen before. In fact, this map looked like a map, very much like a map of where people who don't believe the scientific consensus that humans are causing climate change. It looks like. It looked like a map of where people who don't believe in evolution. It looked like a map of the Southern Baptist Convention, where in this red area here is where the majority religion is our Southern Baptists, and that's what I want. You know, you got this big area here, and you can see it's very precise. Like here's a little sea of Southern Baptists in the middle of Texas, middle of Florida, surrounded by an ocean of blue, which is Catholic. And if you look back at the map, you see some of these very precise patterns of, there's that little Catholic enclave in much of Florida. You can see the same here in New Orleans. New Orleans and this area of southern Louisiana. So I found this interesting. This map just showed up, and I had a picture in my head about this other map, this religious denomination map in the United States. So, and then at the same time in the news, we were hearing all these stories about clergy who were dying from COVID just after preaching about it, amongst the deep skepticism about vaccines that seemed to be running through US, white, especially evangelical Christians. And so that really intrigued me. And I began looking more for maps. Oops, that's not it. That's not it. I began looking more for maps. And I found in the Netherlands, there have been maps of measles outbreaks that occurred in the in what they call the Bible Belt of the Netherlands. Again, where very Orthodox Protestants, Dutch Reformed Church people had a predominance, and that was where you had the active, big measles outbreaks. And in the same way, with COVID, had exactly the same kind of pattern, and that the level of church attendance was strongly correlated with the percentage of the population that had COVID. So again, there was this funny link between religiosity of a certain kind, a fundamentalist religiosity, and this outbreak of this new pandemic. And this was, it was a big deal in the Netherlands. This Netherlands situation also was transmitting measles earlier and COVID back to Canada, to the Fraser Valley here in British Columbia. And so you see this map again. This was now in August. The first map was in April. And see again the comparison between Southern Baptist populations and where COVID was really happening. But then there was this headline or a story in the New York Times in October about the Hasidic backlash. This is the ultra-Orthodox fundamentalist Jewish community were pushing back against COVID restrictions. And they had already had problems in these very, very deeply fundamentalist-oriented Jewish neighborhoods in Brooklyn. Williamsburg, Crown Heights, Borough Park had active measles outbreaks in 2018, where they put zip codes under vaccination orders in Brooklyn. And as COVID began, the same patterns were emerging in New York City, here in the Queens. In Queens, which is these neighborhoods are bordering on Brooklyn, and here Borough Park, and very high percentage of people as not just Jewish but very Orthodox Jewish, and then in Israel, the ultra Orthodox neighborhoods in outside of Tel Aviv at Bnei Barak, they were having problems there with the resistance of the ultra-Orthodox to coronavirus restrictions. But then it wasn't just, the evangelicals in the southern part of the US or the Bible Belt Dutch Reformed Church or the ultra-Orthodox Jews in New York City. It was in the Muslim world. There were very fundamentalist sects in the Muslim world that were seemingly transmitting COVID all over the place. They were evangelical, in the sense of going out and trying to convert others to Islam. And, none of us have a fear of Corona, right? And so that was it. So it was happening in the Muslim world as well. And it was happening, these are newspaper reports, in the Hindu world, that people were traveling around India and were considered to have set off the rapid spread of COVID-19. And in fact, around the Muslim population in India, the Muslim population in India, Muslim clerics were being arrested, and it was said to have led to Hindu nationalists and fundamentalists attacking Muslims around COVID. So then my question was, what is going on here? What started with that one map about Southern Baptists expanded into maps of ultra-Orthodox Jews and Hindus and Muslims. And what it seemed to me that while we know that the spread of COVID-19 was also related to poverty and inequality, and in first world countries, particularly associated with racialized and marginalized communities, what I'm describing here are not necessarily racialized and marginalized communities or necessarily of historically oppressed minorities. What was going on here, I think, is that there were structural barriers in fundamentalist religious beliefs that kept them from hearing and heeding the warnings of science, environment, and health communicators and educators. And while I'm initially talking about COVID, I think the same thing happens. I think the same thing happens with around climate change. And so just want to talk a little bit about fundamentalism, because as it's classically defined by a fellow from the University of Saskatchewan, Rob Altemeyer, says fundamentalism relates to the belief that there's one set of religious teachings that clearly contain the fundamental, basic, intrinsic, essential, inerrant truth about humanity and deity, and that this essential truth is fundamentally opposed by evil, which must be vigorously fought, and that this truth must be followed today according to the fundamental, unchangeable practices of the past, and that those who believe and follow these fundamental teachings have a special relationship with the deity. Other people talk about it as being the militant opposition to the modern world. And again, this author talks about moral absolutist movements in Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and as I pointed out, Hinduism, and I didn't get into Buddhism. And this feature by Kahan, and it was her first in her list of attributes, that fundamentalism has a hostility to many aspects of modernity, especially reason and science as sources of authority. And it was, as I started investigating this question of authority kept on popping up in my thinking and in my reading. And again, while I'm talking about COVID, I think it relates very much to climate change as well. So the basic idea is fundamentalists look for authority. right? It's not necessarily a personality flaw or a quirk or a psychological pathology, but it is something, because it is something that lots of humans do. We do look for authorities at times. These authorities might relate to maybe an exaggerated view of a hierarchical authority, like papal infallibility, and the same is true in the Mormon church, or there may be a group of inerrant texts, the final utterances about the truth of reality. That's another aspect of fundamentalism. Or that one has an authoritative set of texts that cannot be added to. Or that we have this understanding that our religious understandings tell us about the final truth in reality. And this is very much part of these canons of truth are interpreted by individuals and are led by clerics often. So who's an authority then? Well, where secularists reject arguments and claims from religious doctrines often, in many places, in many parts of the world in which we live, not just overseas in places, but right here in North America, there are many people who use religious authority to make all sorts of decisions, not just personal decisions. And the problem is when the religious authorities conflict with the claims of secular authorities, believers have to make a choice as to who are they going to believe, and when you have, that one of the issues with climate change resistance in certain communities, in what I'm calling science resistant religious communities, is that the question of who can speak authoritatively, who can speak legitimately about these large issues is in question in certain people's minds. And that I think I'm sorry, I think the slideshow was set up on a timer and it keeps on jumping ahead. But I think I'm trying to argue that a root cause of the skepticism about climate change science is that practitioners of authoritarian-oriented fundamentalist religions don't and can't take science seriously because they have no need or desire to see science as authoritative, and they have no need of scientists as authorities. They have all the authorities they need, and their authorities speak with the authority of a god, of a deity. And their authorities also threaten misbehavior with, in many cases, some kind of eternal punishment. Religious authorities guide the lives of religious fundamentalists. So here in the science classroom, the little cartoon says, you're going to learn science from the Bible. I mean, I've actually been in situations like this, had very interesting conversations around this issue. Now, I also want to say, I'm making broad generalizations that I think are worth thinking about. And I don't mean to offend anyone in this presentation, but I do feel that fundamentalist belief systems are pretty all-encompassing. And I think they have a difficult time allowing outsiders to have any kind of credibility. So in this ultra-Orthodox community in New York, it's the religious leaders that guide the lives of their followers. And here's a quote from a fellow from the New York Times. "It's not uncommon today for pious, sincere individuals to ask their rabbis advice on questions from the sublime to the ridiculous, having nothing to do with either halakha, which is Jewish law, or hashkafa, which is ideology. But of a practical and mundane character, I have personally been assured by a very sincere individual," this fellow writes, "that a truly religious person will ask his rabbi what color to paint his house, whether to purchase a new car, whether to undertake a new business venture, and the like. What use would someone who is going to ask their religious leader advice about what color to paint his house going to have with a pointy-headed scientist saying, driving your cars and flying back and forth to Tel Aviv is causing climate change. In the evangelical Protestant world, you know, again, from a very significant study, you know, it's a sample of 10,000 Americans, you know, evangelical Protestants are more than twice as likely as the overall sample to say they would turn to a text, religious text or leader if they had a question about science. That evangelicals were more trusting of religious organizations and scientific authorities, and that this trust in gaining important information from religious authorities isn't all that surprising, because distrust of authority serves as a foundational element of evangelical Protestantism. I mean, that's what Martin Luther was really all about. You know, the whole problem with evolution, the conflict and the hell in the high school, right? That fundamentalist Protestantism encourages the teaching of what I would call non-science or anti-science, things like creation science. In the US, a Pew study found that Southern Baptists were the least accepting of evolution, like 24%, compared to Catholics, which would be more than half, in a study of where N is more than 4,000. Sorry, you know, our findings, this report says, indicate that in some circumstances, religious school attendance has a direct, independent effect on adults' orientation towards science. Again, this question of who's the authority, who are you going to listen to when you're thinking about climate change and actions you need to make. Going back to my community, in the Jewish community in New York, they have separate high schools. They're called yeshivas. That there's 28 of them in New York City. They have never given standardized exams, and they did in 2019. Gave them standardized math and reading exams to more than 1,000 students. These are schools where the students essentially don't teach science, and they don't teach much of other secular subjects as other schools, public schools, do. And of those 1,000 students, every one of them failed the test. So they're not being educated to live in a contemporary world. In another study, large US sample, more than 9,000 people, religiosity is associated with lower levels of science literacy. And religiosity is associated with negative attitudes towards science. Religiosity is also associated with lower levels of science literacy resulting from less formal education. So just given that bit of data, what do we do around denial of science, denial of climate change, denial of the efficacy of COVID vaccines? How do we deal with this? This is not simple stuff. You know, what are the domains in which science and a religion can and should speak? Now, one of the great 20th century biologists, a guy I had the real pleasure of spending a couple of days squiring around Victoria, the Harvard biologist Stephen Jay Gould, he talked about the need for respectful non-interference, or what he called non-overlapping magisteria, where he said, science tries to deal with empirical facts, or, and I like this little phrase of his, how the heavens go, whereas religion tries to deal with, excuse the typo, with meaning and morality, you know, which is about how to go to heaven. Non-overlapping large domains of thought, magisteria. But we don't really have this. We don't have a good way of separating these domains within certain communities. So there are lots of theory about how to deal with this. Effective strategies for rebutting science, denialism, and public discussion. This was published, I think, in Science journal Science. Right? If you give people the facts about the topic, ahead of time, you can rebut science denialism by dealing with misinformation. The problem for me is that in order to be able to do this rebutting denialism, both parties have to agree on certain rules for what we decide is truth, what we decide is evidence, and a willingness to look at evidence and make some kind of rational decisions and to reject deliberate distortions. But as I previously noted, fundamentalist religious authorities and followers might not be willing to accept those kinds of ground rules of, rules of evidence, etc. There's a big theory developed by guys, Sander van der Linde at Princeton, Anthony Lazarowitz at George Mason University, and Ed Melbeck also at George Mason. And they're talking about inoculations. But the inoculation, in keeping with that metaphor, is that the uninoculated have to turn up where the shots are being given. And the shots being given, in our case of COVID, let's say, are public health or environmental messages, reported through the mainstream media or government information sources. But there's research to indicate that religiosity has an inverse relationship with trust in science and with putting themselves in, and with reading public media even. Science-resistant religious communities tend to not put themselves in a context where they will be able to get the inoculation because they don't trust it or its source. There was a Roper survey a couple of years ago. 52% of white evangelicals said President Trump was the source they relied on most for news about the coronavirus. Only 26% of the other Americans surveyed saw Trump as a reliable source. 68% of white evangelicals felt mainstream media was exaggerating the coronavirus. So, one more back, sorry. There was a study done a few years ago about newspaper use among Methodists, Mormons, and Orthodox Jews in New York City. And the authors found an unexpected linkage between the degree of religiosity and newspaper use. Individuals across the three faiths who exhibited higher degrees of religiosity read newspapers less. So inoculation may work in mainstream society, but may be an ineffective means of communicating with fundamentalist religious groups. And so the metaphor, I'm not sure this is going to be, the metaphor fails, I think. And then there's a very interesting group of researchers at Yale Law School. Dan Kahane leads this on, he talks about cultural cognition, which is the influence of someone who adheres to the group's value but can bring new ideas into the group. So if you I think there's a woman named I think her last name is Kehoe. She's a climate scientist and evangelical scholar at Texas, one of the Texas universities, and she talks about climate change to her religious community. And the idea is because they see her as being one of them, sharing a cultural way of thinking, a cultural cognition, they're willing to accept some of the things she's saying. This seeks to use leverage to influence the resistant individual through the use of culturally comparable role models who could present a message that the resistant audience would not expect to hear from that role model, but would consider listening to, given the social identity of that communicator. And the problem is that this approach is predicated on the target audience being willing to know what's going on around them, and that they have a modicum of understanding of and respect for a scientific authority who may share the same cultural orientation as they do. But if fundamentalist religious leaders consider authority to be a zero-sum game, where either they have all of it or they have none of it, then they might do what they can reasonably do to maintain their authority by not kind of opening up a space for their followers to countenance even the potential legitimacy of the other side. So someone coming with an other side argument might, again, just not be allowed in. So I just want to finish then with a few thoughts then. What I've tried to explore is that in the context of science and environmental communication and education, fundamentalist religions have an element of what Max Weber, the great kind of modern father of sociology, talked about when he tried to understand authority. He felt there were three grounds on which authority could stand. He felt there were rational grounds. a belief in the legality of enacted rules and the right of those elevated to authority to use their authority under a set of rules. So that's what we do with law, with the legal system. But he also said there are these other kinds of authorities. There's traditional grounds, which are these ideas of the sanctity of tradition, right? Traditional authorities. And there's charismatic authorities. You would a saint, right, have exceptional sanctity, or we often let war heroes in our society become authorities and speak on things that they may have nothing truly important to say. That I think what many of us who can find room to live in a variety of worlds, we can let science be an authority here rationally. But we also recognize there can be some grounds for authority on both traditional grounds and on charismatic grounds. But if one only sees authority in those latter two forms as defined by Max Weber, we are really in trouble, because we are going to miss important things about the world and how the world works. And in a sense, we put everybody at risk. And so I just want to finish with, and this is a quote from a book. Rebecca West was a German, not German, an English journalist, went to the Nuremberg trials, the Nazi war trials, right after the Second World War. And in an essay, she talked about the difference between numbers and words. And I found this statement to be really striking, that numbers triumph in the end. And then for a woman to write this next line, I thought was very interesting. For the sum of wronged husbands' assaults on their wives' lovers is a trifle compared to the terrible revenges that two and two wreak in those who pretend that they do not make four, but they take their time to effect that vengeance. Climate change resistance, COVID denial is all a way of saying two and two don't make four. And in the sense of Rebecca West's, there are terrible revenges that are made on those who pretend that they don't make four, and they take the time to effect that vengeance. I'm putting forward these ideas to you not because I have an answer to the question of how we can better communicate important scientific, environmental, or health-related content to fundamentalist religious communities, but because I think much may hinge on whether better folks than me can find and offer some insights that might help in this very, very important project. So that's the end of my show. And I guess I have to stop sharing the screen. So I wasn't able to look at chat, and totally, I guess you'll.
Thank you, Rick. Yeah, we just start getting some question in the chat if you want to have a look. Or
hey,
I know it's a lesson. It's a lot for everybody to take on. People really like the presentation, but it's a lot to think about for sure.
Yeah. Oh, hi there, you, Ron.
Can you see the question from Shelley? Let me ask, what part of society has been the cause of climate change, religious or secular?
Yeah, well, that's a really great question. I don't think that religious people are the cause of, no, clearly the religious community is not the cause of climate change. In fact, they are a relatively small but influential part of our society, some places more important than others. And that regarding climate change, and the same is true with COVID. I think the COVID one became so interesting to me because a relatively small community of COVID resistors could really become responsible for very large COVID related impacts in terms of spread. Plus the active aggression against the modern science was just really worrying, because that kind of stuff just can lead to all sorts of other dangerous actions on the part of individuals. So while the cause of climate change I don't see as being broken down by religion or secularity, the question would be, where do we put our energy in the future? I'm sure that the energy has to be put into the secular society as well for dealing with the ultimate impacts of climate change. But that's not to say that this particular group of religiously fundamentalist people don't have an impact. And it opened up for me a question about, how do we talk to people who just see the world in such fundamentally different ways, where we don't share very many of the ground rules, and where the question of who's an authority can differ so widely. It just really, that first map just led me on a little bit of a journey that, and I'm in a sense reporting to you now about that journey. And please, I mean, can we let people just speak if they want to come in there?
I see a few people turn on your video, so
Yeah.
Jane, you can go. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I've got thoughts going everywhere. Absolutely fascinating.
Get my pencil and start writing things. Yeah.
One thing that struck me within that, when you were talking about the grounds for authority and the charismatic leadership.
Yeah.
And just before that, you referred to using Trump as a source of scientific information more than scientists.
Yeah.
I mean, from your point of view, would that be, has he created charismatic authority?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I guess I'm just going down that route of, how is somebody so not religious, so fundamentally unreligious as he is, and displaying these different characteristics, managed to tap into that? I mean, I'm from the UK, and I see someone like Boris Johnson, who's the ultimate in upper class, and he's managed to go into working class, tap into that. So, and it just all seems interrelated in that way. And I'm just wondering if we understood more about how this cultural authority, charismatic authority, happens.
Yeah, I mean, it's so strange that a guy who's so clearly unchristian in his daily workings can invoke God and be convincing. So it must be something more, right? It must be something more, that he is confirming some aspect of the way they understand, and they're seeing the surface actions perhaps as being of less important. And another way, and I don't know, Kant told us we should only look at humans as ends in themselves, not as means to an end. But I know within some of the fundamentalist worlds that I have walked in and spent time with, sometimes people are seen very much as means to bigger ends. And I sometimes wonder whether people like Trump, in that religious community, in that Southern Baptist community, was seen more as a means to an end. Yeah, they disliked his treatment of grabbing women, and obviously lying all the time, but he was a means to another end. And and we give that idea of charisma is can be attached to almost anything, right? And no, I think these are for me. I mean, I'm a biologist. Like, what do I know about any of this stuff? But I think they're important questions for us to ask, and as we try to address issues of resistance, climate change resistance. Because I think I mean, the whole resistance model is really interesting. Thinking about if you've not looked at it, Kurt Lewin's work on force field analysis, I think, is really important stuff to think about the drivers of change and the resistance to change, and how we deal with those things. Yeah, it's interesting. Any other kind of thoughts around this? And thank you, Jane, in the UK.
I don't see any more questions. Oh, Yaron
Hey, Ron,
here.
yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Rick. I'd like to first of all thank you very much. It's a fascinating topic, and someone who deals with risk, I'd say it's a dangerous or important to dwell into topic. In our society, we sometimes look for blame or risk. Who's driving climate change, or who's to fault, but when the problems are so big, first thing I would say is maybe we should not put so much emphasis on who's to blame, but more on who can help or who can drive change. And in that sense, I've had the pleasure and frustration and challenge to work with extreme fundamentalists in Israel when I was a scientist there. And over many years, I tried to foster science education in a small town with 20 or 30% fundamentalists, extreme religious people. And it started off, let's say, on two left legs and all the bad things. And we couldn't even overcome the problem of us accepting that we are not allowed to bring female scientists or instructors, which was a great deterror for us. And of course, as a geologist, I wasn't allowed to talk about millions of years at all, which was very frustrating and brought up feelings of blame and feeling of, in a sense, danger, because these people were presenting anti-science attitude. But then I realized I had no choice. I do want to disseminate science. I do want to, make people understand the risk. And even if I don't really feel comfortable with their opinions, I want them to be risk aware, resilient. So I really like what you said about finding different ways of, or different grounds of authority. And what really worked with these religious fundamentalists in my town was putting down sort of base rules that we do not challenge their authority, and that we still, through our charismatic leadership, through our will to work by their rules in their situations towards benefits to everyone, okay, or improvements for everyone. And it wasn't easy because, again, all the female geologists were locked out. They did not have to take part in the outreach activities. And we had to be very careful what we do say and what we don't say. But eventually, we had great success. And I was extremely surprised when head of a yeshiva, a fundamental religious high school, which they do not teach any of the science topics, he selected me as one of the inspirational people of the town. And I guess it was mostly, I wasn't that inspirational. I think he was shocked by how much I was willing to go and accept the context and their rules of engagement in order to send out the message that they should prepare. And it wasn't only about risk preparedness, it was also about sustainable development, which is sometimes hard for fundamentalists, but we managed to connect to parts of their ideology. Okay, so if we accept that we don't challenge their authority, but we do, our homework and we identify parts of their ideology which relates to scientific knowledge, these anchors can be, stepping stones can be built on. And that was successful. But it was apparently all through consistency and persistence, that they realized that, they admired me for my efforts. They realized that they were making us work hard and get out of our comfort zone, and they actually connected to that.
That's great, Yaron. I want to be sure that I wasn't blaming, I'm definitely not blaming climate change on evangelical fundamentalists, and Shelley had the point that modernity, positivism, capitalism, absolutely, and fundamentalists definitely live within boundaries. I mean, they have very tight boundaries. The yeshivas that Yaron was describing. I mean, they are the boundary. Jewish people live in, we're really great at separating things. We have nice tight boundaries. So I hope I wasn't leading anyone to think that I was blaming particular groups of religious individuals for climate change. I was more saying that I saw that trying to get them on board for either climate change actions, as Yaron's talking about geological hazard actions in the southern part of the Negev, or around the issues still existing around vaccinations. This is a particularly tough group to talk to. That for a whole bunch of reasons, they're not just like your regular people for communicating science to. And I think that was really my point. And I think the exemplary work that you've described, Yaron, is great, working within their rules, but you still have to, but there are edges too to how far you can go. You're willing to recognize their authority, maybe in a more expansive way.
I would say that we don't compromise our belief in science, and for us, we try to direct policies by real data and monitoring. But if we can allow or accept that they have their authority, and the only way they will listen to you and respect you with some kind of authority, it would be, like you said, like you suggested, if we can inspire, if we can relate our knowledge to their ideological way of thinking. And it was just, I was very happy to see your way of talking about it making sense for myself about what I went through. So
Interesting.
I think it's fantastically important, and realizing that we care. We care even about strangers that we don't know, and even about people that do not agree with us about anything. We still want them to be, safe if it's climate change, sustainable if it's, other risk or whatever.
Jane, I see you've got your hand up here.
Yeah. Again, thinking back to this idea around authority, I wondered if you had any thoughts on whether it may be easier to use messages around adaptation rather than mitigation. I'm thinking obviously climate here rather than vaccines and things like that. But I'm just wondering if there's something less threatening to authority if we're simply adapting rather than if we're challenging with the sort of the mitigation. Is there any sense in that?
I don't know. That's an interesting question of what would be, it's really, I think the important thing, and it's been very interesting to see in the US, there's a small group of evangelical Christians who have taken on the climate change challenge. See, Richard Chisek is the name of a pastor who has created a whole program around, it's all fundamentally around earth care. It comes from Genesis, not the Genesis 1:26 in the Bible, which says, humans get to run everything the way they want. It's from Genesis 2:14, I think it is, or 13, where it's a second little tiny creation story in the Old Testament, where Adam is put into the garden, and the King James language is to dress it and to keep it. That is, it's not Adam's garden. And it's the beginning of an understanding of stewardship. It's not Adam's garden, but his job is to care for the garden for the king, for God. And so creation care has become a way to begin to talk within that community and again, like Yaron's saying, finding something that we can come to an agreement on, even though we're coming at this from very different directions on these very important, socially important issues, like where he is was geological risk management, but climate change, COVID, and looking for those places of commonality, that we don't have to agree on everything together, but can we agree on enough that we can take appropriate action that will be demonstrably good without challenging either side's fundamental understandings of the world, which is always kind of shaking. And so adaptation could be one way, but mitigation could also be part of this. If as Jesus said, if a rich man has as much chance of getting into heaven as a camel does through an eye of a needle, well, that could be a nice place to start talking about a critique of capitalism, right? Right? How can you go wrong with the Sermon on the Mount? It's right. So, we do need to find those opportunities, I think, for talking with people that come from different starting points, but maybe we can find a way to travel together to come to an important, waypoint on this journey. Even though we come at it from different starting points, and that's always what I try to do, and as I do work in different religious communities.
Thank you, Rick. Yeah, I see a few people interacting in the chat here. A question someone asked me because they had to leave. They were asking, is it something you do on a personal level, or is it something you're teaching in the classroom? Or both?
Well, I've been, talking about this at conferences to people in the community. I think when I last taught the course, the sustainable development course, I probably do bring this up. This is the kind of stuff, I mean, as a teacher, you have all these ideas in your head, and when you're in a classroom, they pop up, right? They come up because someone says something. To me, they're important questions. Again, it's also, in a sense, you could see this presentation, I'm not a scholar of authority, and I'm not a scholar of religious fundamentalism, but it was a map that caught my eye. And I think that one of the wonderful aspects of being an academic is that you not only have the freedom to explore that, but in a sense, your brain is trained to find these patterns and to see these connections. I mean, I knew that map about religious denominations in the United States. That was a pattern that I had in my brain. And there was the New York Times. And bang, what does this have to do with something else? And then, well, from there, looking at maps in Holland, because that's where my family is from. And then, man, going into the COVID in New York City, and then in India and in other Muslim countries. So, I think this is one of the joys of working at a university, and I think one of the obligations for those of us who do is to get out of our little narrow disciplinary orientations. And I shouldn't feel bad about going from biology to geography to fundamentalist religions to Max Weber and sociology. And I think by spanning wider swaths of intellectual territory, sometimes you can get really interesting new insights. And I see myself as an intellectual omnivore, that there's almost nothing I don't find it interesting to eat in a intellectual way. And that's what this whole story, and for me, is really a story of unveiling new things that I had no idea about. It's kind of fun. Yeah.
I see many people clapping in the audience. Thank you. I'm not sure if anyone has a final question here.
But thank you, Jane, and thank you, Yaron, for your comments.
Beautiful really, input.
Yeah. And I'm open to, there's only one Rick Kool at Royal Roads, and there are two Richard Kools in Victoria, so you make sure you get me and not the other guy. But happy to talk with any of you about this if this is something of interest. And Thank you
Wonderful, Rick. I'll make sure to share your email with the recording as well if you're okay with it.
Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you everyone so much for joining today. I see many thanks in the chat coming up.
Well,
thank you,
thank
Rick,
you.
for your time. That was amazing. And I hope everybody has a beautiful day.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you, Nancy, for pulling all this together.